He left me in the rain on Route 9 at 11:42 p.m. It was a small, plain sentence when I said it to myself later, but in the moment it landed like an accusation. He closed the trunk, looked at me as if I were a bag of clothes that no longer fit, and said, "I need you to learn a lesson." He walked toward the house with his umbrella and did not look back. The rain hit my face like cold coins. I pulled my phone from my coat, thumbed open the recorder, and started to film without making a sound. I had been waiting to press record for months. He called himself Michael Whitaker to everyone else. To me, he had been a husband, a partner, the man I trusted with names and numbers and every quiet corner of my life. That night, he became a stranger with a tidy life on paper and a messy ledger behind closed doors. He thought leaving me on the shoulder would humiliate me, would be a punctuation mark at the end of an argument. What he did not know was that I had been collecting the commas and periods of our life for 8 months. Screenshots of transfers, copies of wire confirmations, late-night emails he tried to delete, and a growing stack of receipts that did not match our professed income. I had learned when to hold my voice down and when to make it a record. I remember the cold of the pavement under my shoes, the smell of wet asphalt, the sound of the highway like a low animal in the dark. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth and the muted glow of my phone screen. I remember thinking calm thoughts because anger would make me stupid. I thought of the little red record icon and how simple a thing it was. A small red dot that would prove he was not simply cruel in a moment, but practiced and deliberate. If you have ever had someone who meant to erase you, you know why I chose that red dot. I had help. Not the sort you see in movies, with dramatic allies and perfect timing. Real help came from a handful of people who believed me before they had evidence. My brother Marcus drove out from his apartment in town with a spare jacket and a flask of coffee that tasted like burnt safety. Claire Danvers, my attorney, was already on the line when Michael shut the car door. Dante Reyes, my bodyguard, who had become an unlikely constant in the last year, pulled his truck alongside mine 5 minutes later and handed me a towel without a word. Ethan Morales, the forensic accountant, had been sifting through our accounts for 2 months. There was a web and the wire for the trap already set. If you are watching this and you have ever been told to take the humiliation and be grateful, know this. Some humiliations can be turned into proof. Some departures catch the wind in the wrong way for the person who thinks themselves clever. Stay with me. I am going to tell you exactly how a night that began with a man walking away ended with the freezing of 2 corporate accounts, a walkout by an executive team, and a federal inquiry that put my husband on the other side of a courthouse door. I was not naive about money. I grew up counting change at my mother's small bakery before school, learning to read ledgers as if they were weather patterns. That early training became a muscle I used without thinking. My childhood in a blue house with a sagging porch in Camden was not pretty, but it was honest. My father taught me the names of coins and how to make them add up to something that could buy a winter coat. I went to community college, worked nights, studied numbers, and then transferred to a state university where I majored in communications. It was not the linear climb people like to write about, but it built me. I learned to talk in public, to stand in front of small rooms and explain complicated things in plain language. I married Michael when I was 31 on a September afternoon under a maple tree, half of our friends there and my mother in a bright hat. Years later, I would trace the moment our finances shifted. At first, the changes were small. Another credit card here, a late transfer there, an awkward explanation about business expenses. I rationalized because I loved him and because love gives good explanations for bad behavior. Then I learned that love does not reconcile with lying. My earnings were steady from my consulting work, and yet there were withdrawals I did not authorize and transfers labeled with companies I did not recognize. I once opened an envelope with a check to a shell company named Avon's Logistics and felt my stomach drop. My practice at reading numbers told me a story my heart resisted. We were being run through a system of accounts designed to move money quietly. There were moments in the marriage that looked ordinary, but were staging areas for the control. He told me to empty my pockets before we would leave a restaurant so his card would not be charged for a tiny mistake. He criticized the way I spent on my mother who needed a new roof. He offended me in ways that later fit into a larger pattern of financial isolation. When I finally spoke up, the response was clinical and cold. He called me dramatic and walked me through a spreadsheet with the kind of calm voice people use when they are about to lay blame on someone who matters less. It was in that voice that he taught me to suspect that the ledger was the weapon. After Route 9, after the rain, I gathered the small things I could not lose in a moment, copies of a few infuriating emails, the phone recording, a photograph of a receipt I had taken months earlier. Marcus drove my car back to the house while I sat in the back of Dante's truck, shirt damp, hair plastered to my neck. Dante did not ask me what I wanted to do next. He had already started planning the next 3 moves the way experienced bodyguards do. He said in a voice low and steady, "You do not have to do this alone." He had been assigned to me after a late-night incident at a charity gala where a client had been aggressive. He was not an employee at first in any intimate sense. He was a professional, a man who kept his hands to himself unless a hand needed keeping. In the kitchen under the yellow light, Claire set down a legal pad like it was the heart of a good map. She said, "We can file for an emergency restraining order and a temporary injunction to freeze any accounts associated with joint assets, but I need forensic accounting to give me probable cause." Ethan had already been in touch with her. He would coordinate with the bank and prepare a notice to the compliance department. There would be a cost and process, but Claire seemed to love that ordering quality of law and numbers. She had been a prosecutor for 12 years and now ran a boutique practice focused on financial abuse and domestic fraud. She looked at me and asked, "Is everything recorded?" I said, "I pressed the phone when he said, 'Learn a lesson.'" She smiled in a way that was not quite relief and said, "Good. That is where we start." We moved slowly and precisely. Dante drove me to a small motel room with cheap lamps and a soft hum of refrigeration units. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed with his phone glowing blue and made lists. Dante sat opposite in a creased jacket, smelling faintly of lemon and engine, and Claire paced and gave orders like a conductor. I lied down for a few minutes and felt the rain cool my skin through the thin fabric. The motel carpet held a dampness that smelled faintly of bleach and cigarettes, the kind of smell that makes you remember you are alive because you must be. I remember the sound of my phone when Marcus texted the first bank name that matched a transfer we had seen. It was a small sound among many, but it meant movement. Over the next week, we built a dossier. Riley Chen, a private investigator I had hired through an online recommendation, pulled public filings and cross-referenced addresses used by companies Michael claimed to control. Riley's voice was matter-of-fact on the phone when he said, "There are corporate names using a registered agent tied to a mail forwarding service in Delaware, and 3 transfers to accounts in Luxembourg that clear into a New York trust." I asked what that meant in plain English, and he said, "It means your money takes a plane ride you did not buy a ticket for." I laughed then, a dry sound, which was quickly swallowed by the more serious logistics. Riley was thin and precise when he spoke in person. His breath smelled faintly of peppermint gum and early rising. He handed over a thick envelope of printouts, wire confirmations, account statements, screenshots of online banking, and copies of invoices that seemed to pay the same vendor twice on the same day. Ethan sat in his small office, which smelled of coffee and paper glue, and walked me through the accounting anomalies. He is 42, with a quick brow line and the kind of patience you need when you stare at columns for hours. He said, "This is layering. The transfers move from the operating account into intermediary accounts and then disperse. The pattern is consistent with hiding income from shareholders and partners." He explained chain of custody rules for digital evidence and how metadata proves time and origin. When I asked how confident he was, he said, "I would need subpoenas to bank records to be certain, but what I see here is not an accident." That sentence felt like a verdict I had been waiting for. We began to name the players as if naming them would make them smaller. Michael Whitaker, CEO of Whitaker Holdings. Veronica Lane, who became an increasingly familiar name in the forwarded messages. Robert Latham, regional bank manager in Manhattan, who answered calls on a certain line. Senator Hale, who liked to be photographed at charity dinners. And a chorus of company officers whose signatures smudged across documents I had never seen before. I learned to say names in a list like a spell. Each name added weight. Each name connected a transfer or a signature to something human. I wrote them in my notebook with a red pen until the ink smudged in the rain. One night at 2 a.m., sitting in the motel room with a lukewarm cup of coffee, I listened to the recording. Michael's voice is calm and brittle. He said, "You needed to be taught." The recorder caught a rustle as he closed the trunk and the faint sound of tires on wet pavement. That small, ordinary sound would travel farther than he intended it to. Clear told me the recording could be played in court if it was obtained lawfully and if we could authenticate chain of custody. Dante understood chain of custody for people. Ethan explained it for data. Riley promised he could serve notice for preservation of electronic evidence. We had an army, and none of them wore armor. The first technical step was an audit request to one of the banks. I will explain the audit process here in plain terms. A forensic audit begins with a scope, which is a clear set of questions about transactions and accounts. The auditor requests bank statements, wire confirmations, and beneficiary information. They verify metadata, look for round trips and layering, and produce a report that traces funds from origin to destination. It is both accounting and detective work. The auditor documents every step so that a judge can see not only what happened, but how the auditor came to that conclusion. That documentation is the backbone of any legal move to freeze assets or to support a criminal referral. Claire filed an emergency motion at the courthouse. She asked for a temporary restraining order to prevent the dissipation of assets and for an order compelling the bank to preserve records. There is a way legal words can make you feel protected. The judge, a man named Judge Alvarez, signed the order after an ex parte hearing, which meant we presented our case without the other side in the room. It was one of the first moments I allowed myself to breathe. The order asked banks to preserve communications and to suspend transfers related to accounts associated with Whitaker Holdings pending further review. It also asked for a hearing within 7 days. Hearing the word ex parte makes the stakes feel both real and immediate. On the day of the hearing, I sat in the back of the courtroom, palms damp. Dante in the pew behind me like a shadow, Marcus next to me with a face that was too young for the worry he carried. Claire stood and presented the facts in a voice that made the dry legal forms sound like a narrative. She read the timeline, the transfers, the suspicious offshore conduits. The defense lawyer, Andrew Monk, who represented Whitaker Holdings, smiled like a man who thinks the courthouse is a theater. He said, "My client is accused based on suspicion and a selective interpretation of transfers." He called my evidence circumstantial. Claire answered with the sound of the recording and the list of intercepted wires. It is difficult to describe the sensation of watching a page of your life be read aloud as if someone else has written it. It is harder to explain how satisfying it felt when the bailiff stood and the judge said, "For now, the temporary order stands." The court allowed a narrowly tailored set of disclosures. The bank compliance officer, a woman named Nia Patel, sent accountants to our counsel and to Ethan with sealed boxes of records. She called the transfers irregular and pledged cooperation. Her voice on the phone that day was cautious and careful, the kind of tone people use when a regulator might be listening. The bank itself would later say on record that their policy required them to escalate any suspicious activity and to cooperate with law enforcement. That was a point of leverage we needed. At roughly 33% into the story of our fight, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If you are feeling shock, disbelief, or the urge to look away, if what I am saying resonates because you have seen similar signs in your own life, tell me in the comments one single word. Was it audacity, shame, surprise, or resilience? Drop one word so others can see they are not alone. If you were shocked by how calm he sounded, write audacity. If you were struck by how the bank reacted, write compliance. Your word helps us know which piece of the story lands hardest and helps others find the language they need to describe their own experience. This is not a plea for sympathy. It is a call for community. Your one word may help someone realize they have evidence they never thought to collect. Your single reply might guide our next investigation. We will read every comment and use what we learn to bring more clarity to similar cases. Thank you for staying and for lending your single word to a conversation that matters. After we pressed record and filed the motion, the real work of assembling witnesses began. We needed testimony from employees who had seen the transfers, from the bank compliance officer, from an accountant in Luxembourg who signed an affidavit we obtained through a subpoena, and from a former executive who had been quietly removed from the inner circle. That executive, Jonah Pierce, became a reluctant witness. He had left Whitaker Holdings quietly the year before, carrying a feeling like regret and a strict non-disclosure agreement that tried to contain him. Jonah was a soft-spoken man with a habit of turning his ring on his finger when he lied. He told us in a recorded interview, "I saw invoices that did not match services, and I saw transfers that did not have business purposes." That sentence was small and damning. We staged a press leak to test reactions. Laura Chen, a reporter from a financial daily who had once covered Michael for a profile on philanthropic giving, agreed to listen before we released everything. She arrived at a diner, notebook open, late afternoon, her coat damp from drivel. The smell of fried eggs and coffee thickened the room. She asked, "Why come to me?" I said, "Because the public thinks he is untouchable." She looked at the documents and then at me and said, "If this is what it looks like on paper, there will be teeth in this." Her story ran with careful hedging because reporters protect themselves, but the leak forced the company to respond publicly with a statement about internal governance practices and an independent review. The statement was hollow then, but it gave us names and dates that would tighten the screws. The first moment of real escalation came when I walked into a small conference room at Claire's firm and watched as the recording played in front of an investigator from the United States Attorney's Office, a woman named O.S.A. Ramirez. She sat with a tablet and listened intently, her brows knitting in a way that suggested something beyond mere interest. When the recording ended, she did not speak at once. She said, "We can open a criminal inquiry if we can show intent to defraud and if the funds moved across state lines." That phrase, intent to defraud, felt like a legal battery. It meant what I had felt in my bones could be translated into elements the law recognizes. The federal interest brought new variables: grand juries, subpoenas, federal law enforcement. Suddenly, the fight had a chest behind it. The day the enforcement agents arrived at my house, the sky was low and gray. Their presence was surreal in a domestic space. Two agents in plain clothes explained that they were there to serve a preservation order and to collect digital devices. Dante stood at the doorway like someone posted at a gate. He did not interfere, but his shoulders squared in a way that suggested he would if asked. Agents bagged laptops and devices and asked me to sign a custody form. The process of bagging felt cinematic, but also deeply administrative. They labeled each item, wrote serial numbers, and explained the chain of custody. The formality was consoling in a cold way. It meant the evidence would not be allowed to evaporate. The chain of custody for a digital phone is fragile and also strict. Here is a short technical note in plain terms that is important. When a phone recording is taken as evidence, investigators create a digital hash, which is a unique identifier for the file. That hash is generated at the time of collection, and any subsequent change alters the hash. Investigators store the original file in a secure evidence locker and keep a log of every person who accesses it. This preserves authenticity for court. That step was critical for our case because without an unbroken chain, the recording could be challenged. Ethan worked with the agents to generate the hash and to verify timestamps. After the raid, Whitaker Holdings issued a public statement denying wrongdoing and accusing me of a vendetta. Their legal team, led by Andrew Monk, sent a letter to our counsel threatening defamation suits. I watched my name placed in centuries of legal words and felt something like being pulverized by formality. Monk was smooth in court, an old defense hand who never seemed to raise his voice. I met him once across a hallway, and he said, "Ms. Whitaker, you are an interesting woman." The words were meant to be flattering and threatening at once. Claire said, "We expected posturing. We will let the facts do the talking." In the week leading to the emergency hearing, Dante became more than a guard. He began to act like someone whose job included protecting evidence of life. He drove me to meet a former assistant of Michael's who refused to speak publicly but agreed to leave a voicemail for Claire, saying, "If they ask me about the Luxembourg wires, tell them that I saw the transfers." She left the message and then erased it out of fear. Dante sat with the assistant in a small parking lot until she could call and leave the message. The assistant's breath came in quick apologies, and the smell of her underarm sweating hit me with the intimacy of fear. The hearing that followed was a build-up to the public unraveling. We had witnesses who could explain the transfers, the chain of emails, and the shell companies. The judge allowed limited testimony, and he signed a more robust preservation order. The judge's clerk handed me a copy in the hallway and said, "Ms. Whitaker, you should be careful." That was both advice and a warning. I understood that our path from here was not simply legal but social. We would be scraped and inspected, and some of what we were fighting to protect would be tossed like worthless coin into the public square. The first major confrontation happened in a special hearing room where the company board had been compelled to appear along with a subset of executives. Jonah Pierce, who had been removed from leadership, took the stand, and his voice shook with the gravity of what he saw and what he had not stopped. He named Veronica Lane as someone who facilitated certain transfers and indicated her presence at meetings where contracts were rubber-stamped. Veronica's presence in emails suggested she was more than a shadow. Her husband returned calls with legal threats. The pattern we had suspected was starting to get a shape the law recognized. Courtroom scenes are a theater of small things. I remember the scrape of a chair, the rustle of a paper, the click of a pen. When the recording of Michael was played in open court, I watched his face go pale in a press box on the other side of the room. The sound came through the speakers, thin and precise. When he said, "Learn a lesson," some people in the gallery shifted, and a woman near the front covered her mouth. The judge paused and then asked for more background. The defense tried to frame the audio as taken in a private marital dispute, not proof of financial wrongdoing. Claire answered with the wire confirmations and with Ethan's analysis showing that the dates of transfers lined up with the days after certain decisions. The prosecution would later say the pattern was consistent with intent. There were moments of rawness even as the legal machine picked up its gears. Marcus wept quietly in the hallway when an aide handed him a folder with additional transfers. He kept saying, "How did we not see this?" I put my hand on his shoulder and felt his spine shake. Dante squeezed my back in a way that meant you do not have to keep moving all the time. Those small human gestures balanced the procedural coldness with the heat of real life. As the federal inquiry became formal, the case broadened into questions of wire fraud and bank fraud. The AUSA, Ramirez, convened a grand jury to evaluate whether there was probable cause for indictment. Grand jury proceedings are private and procedural, but their effect is public. The possibility of a federal indictment changed the stakes for everyone. Banks froze accounts associated with certain corporate entities while they evaluated subpoenas and compliance obligations. The freeze itself is drastic. It stops movement of funds and raises immediate alarms for a company that depends on cash flow. Whitaker Holdings issued statements about liquidity and about the inconveniences of discovery. Their stock price slid in small ticks. We had one catastrophic setback when a backup server that we believed would contain thousands of emails was found to have been wiped. That moment felt like a punch. For a day, I could think of nothing but the circular sound of information lost. But Riley, our private investigator, did not panic. He found a set of emails archived on a third party and pulled them out like a diver finding a sunken box. The messages included an email from Michael to a consultant about the movement of funds and a separate note where he praised Veronica for her decisiveness. Those emails moved us from suspicion to a narrative that could convince a jury. The trial that followed was not a single day, but a marathon. Witnesses stood and gave testimony about transfers, signatures, and corporate decision-making. Ethan testified for hours about the flow of funds and how layering hides origins. He explained that in our case, transfers were routed through a network of accounts in Luxembourg and then into domestic trusts, a technique used to avoid detection and to separate funds from their original assets. He kept his language simple and his charts clear. The defense tried to poke holes, suggesting coincidence and innocent business practice. Claire cross-examined with the quiet intensity of someone who has made a life out of finding the seam in a story and tugging. There were several dramatic moments in the courtroom that I remember with the intensity of a dream. One was when the former CFO of Whitaker Holdings, who had negotiated contracts for years, admitted on the stand that he had signed invoices without seeing deliverables because he trusted executives who said everything had been done. He said, "I acted on trust in a culture that discouraged questions." That admission was more devastating than anything the prosecution had hoped for because it showed an institutional culture that enabled abuse. Another moment came when Veronica Lane, testifying under subpoena, avoided direct answers and used legal wordcraft to deflect. The jury watched her with the kind of silence that makes actors in a play feel small. The defense tried to chip away at the recording, to claim it was selective and taken out of context. But the prosecution had done the work. They had timestamps, wire confirmations, and an email where Michael congratulated a partner for getting certain transfers done ahead of schedule. Each piece interlocked. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the verdict came back guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud and bank fraud, the sound in the courtroom changed. It was a small sound. People exhaled in a way that hurt my ears because the relief was real. Michael sat with his head bowed and then looked up like someone who had been found out. The sentencing was a different kind of theater. The judge consulted guidelines and then spoke of betrayal and the misuse of trust. He sentenced Michael to 5 years, a term that will be debated by those who think him either lucky or condemned. The court also ordered restitution to be paid and directed that corporate leadership undergo reforms and independent oversight. Whitaker Holdings agreed to cooperate with regulators and to accept new compliance measures. There was a mandatory compliance officer named by the court and an independent monitor. The bank faced internal disciplinary action for failing to escalate earlier alerts. It was not total justice in the way a novel might promise, but it was tangible consequence. There were practical fallouts that became part of everyday life. Our assets were in the middle of legal wrangling, and the freeze on accounts meant we had to live on the kindness of friends for a time. Marcus moved in for a month to help with paperwork. Claire arranged for emergency access to a small escrowed account so we could pay bills. Dante, who had been paid through Michael, insisted on being compensated for his work in front of the company, so there was no narrative he had been there for personal reasons. He told a reporter once, "I was hired to protect a client, and if a client needs help beyond physical protection, I will do what is right." That line was likely the closest we would come to seeing the man behind the professional. 6 months later, Whitaker Holdings restructured their board. The company installed new compliance systems, required dual signatories on certain large transfers, and engaged a firm to oversee offshore relationships. The bank that had held some of the key accounts undertook an internal review of its compliance protocols and replaced the regional manager. For a while, every corporate filing seemed to carry a little more honesty, not out of virtue, but out of the pressure of oversight. The story reverberated in the community and among clients who felt betrayed. A few of the more vulnerable clients, who had been quietly manipulated into investments tied to shell entities, sought legal help and received some restitution. There were moments of betrayal among people we once trusted. A former assistant I had thought a friend declined to testify, citing fear and loyalty. A board member who had once shared wine with Michael quietly resigned and then settled with the company. Veronica Lane left the country before the sentencing and used layers of consultants to obscure her trail. The criminal justice system does not always catch everyone who arranges and facilitates. We learned that there are limits to what law can demand, and more often than not, it demands the courage of the small people who will step forward. Throughout the process, Dante evolved from a tactical protector to a friend. He attended hearings, sat in the back of the courtroom, and sometimes met me in the parking lot to hand me a coffee. Once, after a particularly bruising day of testimony, he said, "You were more patient than I would have been." I told him I had to be because this was more than a fight about money. It was about truth. He nodded and said, "The man who left you on the shoulder thought he could stage you out of the picture. He did not know you could build a case while he walked away." There were procedural lessons along the way that are worth explaining to anyone who thinks the legal system is quick. A freeze of accounts is an emergency remedy that requires probable cause and judicial approval. A preservation order forces banks to stop deletion and overwriting. Grand jury proceedings can compel testimony but are secret. An indictment moves a case to a trial where rules of evidence govern what jurors may hear. Each step has its own timeline and its own burdens. We moved through months of paperwork, subpoenas, and depositions. It was tedious and exhausting and felt sometimes like standing in line at a bureaucratic office where the stakes are life. The epilogue of our story has 3 measurable points in time because time matters when rebuilding. 1 month after the verdict, I moved into a smaller place with sunlight that pooled in the kitchen and a lock that made a satisfying click. Once, after a particularly bruising day of testimony, he said, "You were more patient than I would have been." I told him I had to be because this was more than a fight about money. It was about truth. He nodded and said, "The man who left you on the shoulder thought he could stage you out of the picture. He did not know you could build a case while he walked away." There were procedural lessons along the way that are worth explaining to anyone who thinks the legal system is quick. A freeze of accounts is an emergency remedy that requires probable cause and judicial approval. A preservation order forces banks to stop deletion and overwriting. Grand jury proceedings can compel testimony but are secret. An indictment moves a case to a trial where rules of evidence govern what jurors may hear. Each step has its own timeline and its own burdens. We moved through months of paperwork, subpoenas, and depositions. It was tedious and exhausting and felt sometimes like standing in line at a bureaucratic office where the stakes are life. The epilogue of our story has 3 measurable points in time because time matters when rebuilding. 1 month after the verdict, I moved into a smaller place with sunlight that pooled in the kitchen and a lock that made a satisfying click. I felt fragile and oddly unmoored. Friends came by with casseroles. Marcus helped me sort files and old receipts. The little rituals of daily life returned slowly: grocery shopping, walking the dog, answering emails. The bank allowed a small emergency allowance for living expenses through the escrow Claire set up. I started journaling again and found some lines about gratitude that I did not feel fully until later. 3 months later, I launched the Bridge Project, a small nonprofit to help people who had been victims of financial manipulation. We offered pro bono consultations with forensic accountants and referrals to attorneys who specialized in domestic financial abuse. Dante advised on personal safety plans, and Claire volunteered time for initial intake interviews. The Bridge Project was small at first, but meaningful. We documented cases and provided a guide on collecting and preserving evidence. The guide explained how to take screenshots, store emails, make private recordings lawfully in jurisdictions where that is allowed, and how to ask banks for transaction histories. We hosted a webinar with Ethan and Riley, and 100 people signed up. I slept poorly those months, but also felt a steadying sense. 6 months after the verdict, the foundation had supported 5 clients to the point where they had reunited their financial lives. We advocated for policy changes regarding mandatory banking alerts and for ordinances requiring public companies to disclose tighter compliance measures. We met with a state legislator who was interested in a bill to standardize bank reporting of suspicious activity concerning domestic disputes. The work was messy, collective, and slow, but it created a new meaning from deep loss. I would sometimes sit in a room with other women and men who had been through similar ordeals and feel the power of shared work transform private pain into public remedy. The final reflection is personal. He thought that leaving me on the shoulder would break me into pieces that could be cataloged and taken. He misread me. I learned that patience and planning are not passive. They are weapons of a different kind. I learned how to take small humiliations and turn them into records that could be read by others. I learned that there are people who will stand with you: a brother who packs your car in the cold, a lawyer who reads the pages you can't, an accountant who sees audit trails like rivers, a private investigator who follows the streams, a bodyguard who brings a towel and a later a coffee, and a stranger who reports a discrepancy to a regulator. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more cases where personal betrayal meets public accountability. If you have a single word about what surprised you most, please leave it in the comments so others can find a language for their experience. Share this video with someone who needs to know that evidence can be built privately before it is revealed publicly. Justice is not always swift, but it is often precise when it is prepared. I end with a small truth that changed me. I am not the woman who pressed record by accident. I am the woman who pressed it on purpose because I wanted the truth to have a chance to breathe. He left me in the rain thinking the water would wash away the threads of his track. It did not. It only made the trail of his choices visible. The monitors, the courts, the reforms, and the few years in a federal sentence do not erase the ache of betrayal, but they do make clear that methodical preparation can expose a system built to hide. If you are in a place where you think someone is moving things that should belong to you, seek help, document what you can, and remember that small recorded dots can become a map to justice.